Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Bradley, and I will be your moderator. Thank you for joining us today for the second webinar in our series with Stan Garfield called Profiles in Knowledge, which is part 2, Big Picture, the Future, Intellectual Capital, ISO Standard, and Strategy. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadristar. Now, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Stan Garfield. Stan is a respected knowledge management practitioner, author, speaker, and community leader, and he has also provided us with many great webinars that are listed on our website, so please feel free to check those out after today's session. Take it away, Stan.
Thanks, Brad, and welcome everyone to the second in this series on Profiles in Knowledge. This is based on the Thought Leader series that I've been featuring through Lucidea for the past couple of years on their Think Clearly blog, where we've been writing profiles every week about women and men in the field. We started out with 60 of the women thought leaders in knowledge management, and now we're into the 60 men. For the purposes of this webinar, we've grouped them into 20 categories, and we're doing a series of 4 webinars of 5 categories each, and this will culminate later this year when we publish the book Profiles in Knowledge, including all 120 of the thought leaders. So today's categories, we're going to cover big picture, the future, intellectual capital, the ISO standard, and strategy. So let's start with the big picture. And the themes for big picture, which implies a broad view of knowledge management and all of its different elements and aspects. We'll talk about sustainable KM, consciousness studies, definitions, models, architecture, the value of KM, the 11 deadly sins of KM, and success factors for KM. And the thought leaders that we'll cover in this section include Mary Abraham, Alex Bennett, Joanne and John Gerard, Murray Jennings, Matt Moore, Larry Pruzak, and Mohan Rao. We'll start with Mary Abraham. Mary is an author, consultant, and facilitator who's been active in the legal industry since 1991. She practiced corporate law at a top-tier international firm and helped lead its knowledge management efforts. She's also the former academic director of Columbia University's Master of Science program, the IKNS program. She co-founded a digital startup called Broadly Incorporated, and one of her skills is that she can rapidly blog detailed conference sessions, and she's done that at conferences like KM World and cranks out really good summaries at the end of each session. She's written a book called Optimizing Law Firm Support Functions, and she's contributed a chapter to Smarter Innovation, and those are the publications that she's got. And now we're going to show for each one of these a model or an insight or a graph or a chart or a list. And as I mentioned in the last webinar, and I'll repeat today, we're going to go through these quickly, so we won't have a lot of time to stop and look at each one of them, but the recording of the webinar will be available shortly after this session is presented, and you can go back to it, stop and start it, and pause on any of the screens to look at any of these models in more detail, and I encourage you to do that. So Mary's model about access to social capital is that social capital depends on who you know, the size, quality, and diversity of your personal and business networks, but also who you don't know, your network's network. Next is Alex Bennett. Alex is the co-founder of the Mountain Quest Institute along with her husband, David Bennett. She's the former Chief Knowledge Officer and Deputy CIO for Enterprise Integration for the U.S. Department of the Navy. She's the former co-chair of the Federal Knowledge Management Working Group, and her interests include knowledge sharing, learning theory, change leadership, consciousness studies, collaborative leadership, thought leadership, decision-making, and complexity theory. She's written a number of books, more than we show here, but we're picturing these as part of the big picture. Her book, Reblooming the Knowledge Movement, is something that she recently presented on a SIKM Leaders Community Call, which she co-wrote with Robert Turner. She has a book called Innovative Creativity that she co-wrote with Arthur Shelley and Charles Dewa, and Unleashing the Human Mind, which she did with her husband David and with Robert Turner. This particular graph contains a lot, but it talks about a cycle starting with plan that you see in the upper right, and then moving through assess, prepare, and implement, and sustain. So highlighting one from each of these phases: under plan, nurturing and innovation culture; under assessment, assessing the readiness for the unknown; under prepare, provide a meaning framework; under implement, include resonance and coherence; and then in sustain, an element of self-leadership. You can see that there's a lot more there, and if you're really interested in this, I would go back and refer to the books that I showed that Alex has written. Joanne Gerard, another member of a husband and wife team, is the co-founder and managing partner of Sagology, a firm that focused on connecting people with people to collaborate and share knowledge. She researched information anxiety, enterprise dementia, and organizational memories, and she explored social media with a view to determining what organizational leaders need to know. Among her books are these three: Knowledge Management Matters, which is something that she and John co-edited and contributed to chapter 2. I also have a chapter in that book. Another one is A Leader's Guide to Knowledge Management, also with her husband John. And then Social Knowledge, Using Social Media to Know What You Know, once again with her husband John. One of the things that they worked on was looking at definitions of knowledge management. I thought it'd be interesting to share with you the results of some work that she did to show the different words that have been used to define knowledge management. There are many definitions of KM. What she did was to look and see which words showed up the most. And not surprisingly, knowledge showed up the most, 112 instances. But as you look down the first of these two slides, you'll see the other words that seem to pop up the most, including words like organization and process. And then as you move to the second slide, you can see fewer instances, but still a large number of different words, all of which were mentioned at least 4 different times in definitions of knowledge management. Her husband, John Gerard, is a professor, consultant, author, and editor, and his research interests include KM, social media, virtual business, innovation, and globalization. He actually had a military career before his academic career, where he had experience as a leader, trainer, policy officer, HR manager, and project manager in the public sector environment. He served as Director of Knowledge Management at the National Defense Headquarters in Ottawa, and he's the Peyton Anderson Endowed Chair at Middle Georgia State University. Among his books, we've already featured one that actually this one is another one called Business Goes Virtual that he did with Joanne and also with Cindy Gordon, a book called Building Organizational Memories that he wrote, and then another one that he co-wrote called Strategic Database Wisdom in the Big Data Era. He has the Inukshuk model based on sort of a Canadian First Peoples model, where he shows leadership supported by pillars of technology and culture, and building on that, the 2 forms of knowledge, tacit and explicit knowledge. And then you have Nanaka's SECI model, socialization, externalization, combination, internalization, and then measurement above that, dividing them up into 2 categories of the foundation, which is leadership, technology, and culture, and then the things above, which he defines as process. Murray Jenex is a professor currently at West Texas A&M University, although he was one at San Diego State for many years. He's the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Knowledge Management, the president of the Foundation for Knowledge Management, and he specializes in knowledge management, crisis response, system analysis and design, security, e-commerce, and organizational effectiveness. And for many years, he served as the Knowledge Systems Track co-chair at the Hawaii International Conference on Systems Science that's held in January every year in Hawaii. Murray has written and edited a large number of books. You can see most of them here on this screen, covering a variety of topics, but he's certainly been a prolific author and editor in the field, and one of the leaders in academic knowledge management. The model that Murray has contributed is called the Knowledge Systems Architecture. And as we go through many of these models in this and other slideshows, you'll see that there's a lot of commonality amongst them, as you would expect. So he has strategy at the top, built on process, and then with system as the base, but then he has culture as sort of the bedrock under that. So with knowledge, transactions, content, collaboration, competence, and orientation as the pillars under the system, And then at the top, under knowledge systems, he's got knowledge society, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Matt Moore is a blogger, presenter, webinar host, and a deep thinker. He worked in the knowledge management field for over 20 years, although I don't think he's working in it currently. He developed knowledge management strategies, implemented content management systems, facilitated communities, developed classroom and e-learning programs, and developed marketing programs for corporations, government agencies, and nonprofits. Matt has not published any books, but he's also a prolific provider of videos. He recorded a lot of webinars, and here's 4 that I chose to highlight. One called Building Competencies for Knowledge Organization, one called KM plus Artificial Intelligence equals what? Another one called More Than a Feeling, Emotions and Knowledge Management, and then Words at Work. Matt's a very creative thinker and also an entertaining presenter. One of his models shown here shows the value of KM and the value drivers that go into it. So on the left, you see communities of practice, after action reviews, and blogs. And then the different elements that are in the middle, which include risk management down through new product development, and then the interactions between them, the different arrows going over to costs and revenue, helping to show the value of knowledge management using these factors. The late Larry Prusek unfortunately passed away last year. Larry was someone that was widely respected and loved in the field. He was a researcher, consultant, author, speaker, and teacher. Certainly had one of the great minds in the field, provided useful insights based on his extensive reading, his keen observations, and deep thinking. He was the founder and executive director of IBM's Institute for Knowledge Management, and he co-directed with Tom Davenport, who we featured last month, at the Working Knowledge Research Center program at Babson College, where he was a distinguished scholar in residence. And he was also the principal and founder of Ernst & Young's Center for Business Innovation, specializing in issues of corporate knowledge management. Larry was the author or co-author of many books that you see listed here, including the one up in the upper left, Working Knowledge, that he co-wrote with Tom Davenport, considered one of the seminal texts in the field of knowledge management, but you certainly see a lot of others that he had a hand in creating. A couple of things that I featured from Larry, a couple of his ideas. On the left, highlighting the percentage of workers' time spent in these different categories, showing that adapting knowledge gained was the largest percentage of time, and the second largest was eliciting knowledge from experts. Then underneath, scheduling meetings with experts and searching for knowledge. So understanding how people spent their time and the importance of knowledge management because of how much time they spend in these areas was one of his contributions. He's definitely focused on the people side of knowledge management. And he also then came up with this list of the 11 deadliest sins of knowledge management. Won't go through all of the 11, but you can see that it ranges from not developing a working definition of knowledge, through emphasizing knowledge stock to the detriment of knowledge flow, and then down to the bottom where substituting technological contact for human interface and seeking to develop direct measures of knowledge. He once said that if you had $1 to spend on knowledge management, you should spend 1 cent of it on technology and 99 cents of it getting people together. Maidan Rao is an author and consultant in knowledge management and new media. He's the research director at Your Story Media, which is a platform for startups and investors in India. He's the co-founder of the Bangalore K community, and his specialties include entrepreneurship, knowledge management, innovation, digital, ICT 4D, which is information and communications technologies for development, and content management. The books that Maidan has written include Knowledge Management Tools and Techniques, which he was the editor of, Leading with Knowledge, and Knowledge Management Initiatives in Singapore. Now, many of you are familiar with the fact that I wrote a book for Lucidea called The 5 C's of Knowledge Management. The number of C's is a familiar theme, not only in knowledge management, but in all fields. But Maidan has had his own list of the 8 C's of success in the knowledge era. So here are his 8 C's, which include capacity, cooperation, commerce, capital, connectivity, content, community, and culture. Moving to our second area for today's call, the future. The focus areas in this include the future of work and the enterprise of the future. And our two thought leaders that we're going to describe today are Ross Dawson and Art Murray. Ross Dawson is the founder and CEO of Findability. He's the founding chairman of Advanced Human Technologies Group. He's a futurist, speaker, strategy advisor, author, and entrepreneur, and he has expertise in future thinking and long-term strategy. Ross is based in Australia. Here are 5 of the books that he's written, including Thriving on Overload, Developing Knowledge-Based Client Relationships, Getting Results from Crowds, Implementing Enterprise 2.0, and Living Networks. He's got a rather detailed model that I chose to share with you on humans and the future of work. And there's a number of things that you can draw from this, but what I get from this is the importance of the distinctive human capabilities in the middle. So with all the talk today on artificial intelligence, which he features over in the lower left corner under automation, he still sees the unique contributions that humans can make in this. So there's a number of things listed there that he believes that humans can do best. And then he has the structure of work over to the right side. So integrating those elements of automation and the human capabilities and the structure of work, which include work design and high-performance organizations, are part of the future of work in Ross's view. Art Murray is the CEO of Applied Knowledge Sciences, which is a consultancy. He's a consultant author, a KM World Magazine columnist, speaker, and workshop leader. He has expertise in knowledge management and the enterprise of the future. And his specialties include transforming traditional organizations into knowledge-sharing enterprises, human deep learning, building and curating e-bodies of knowledge, and organizational knowledge governance. Art's written a couple of books, The Deep Learning Manual and Building the Enterprise of the Future, which he subtitles Co-Creating and Delivering Extraordinary Value in an 8 Billion Mind World. This slide, Building the Enterprise of the Future, talks about if your speed of change, the rate at which your organization innovates and learns, is slower than that of your industry, you're continually falling behind in a vicious cycle. So eventually you'll be out of business. If you want to succeed and grow, your organization needs to change at least as fast as or faster than the speed of change in your industry. So he has a little model there, which once again includes the familiar elements of strategy, people, processes, and technologies, with the inputs flowing through and coming out as the outputs of high-value products and services. Our third category today, intellectual capital, and we'll define 3 of the concepts. There's a number of different terms that fall into this category. We'll talk about intellectual capital, which is the sum of everything everybody in a company knows that gives it a competitive edge. Intellectual property, which is any intellectual creation such as literary works, artistic works, inventions, designs, and so forth. And knowledge assets, an organization's accumulated intellectual resources, which include things like information, learning, ideas, understanding, and so forth. Knowledge assets reside in documents, databases, software, patents, policies, procedures, and more. So these are the 3 broad, and we'll see a lot of other terms here in a moment. Our thought leaders in this category are Mary Adams, Nick Bontis, Leif Edmondson, Addie Green, Gordon Petrash, Hubert St. Onge, Tom Stewart, Carl Eric Sveibe, and Carl Waig. Mary Adams is the co-founder of Insight 7, which focuses on sustainability integration solutions. She's the founder of Smarter Companies, the co-founder of Trek Consulting. She specializes in intangible capital, the multi-capital model, integrated thinking, and integrated management. And the focus of her work is bringing sustainability and long-term thinking into business decisions. She's written a book called Intangible Capital, co-written it. And here's a graph showing how to measure intangible capital with the ecosystem strength. And at the bottom right, you see it says I counting, which would be intellectual capital counting, measures the strength of the intangible capital that makes up the ecosystem connecting IT and innovation. And if you see the graph on the upper right, you'll see that the bar that's going up the highest there in the middle is the category of knowledge and intellectual property. Nick Pontus is the chair of strategic management at the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University in Canada. He's the director of the Institute for Intellectual Capital Research, and his research focuses on business performance, intellectual capital knowledge management, organizational learning, collaboration, human capital measurement, and digital transformation. He has expertise in leadership and productivity, management of change, information overload, knowledge sharing, innovation and creativity, team collaboration, and talent retention. Here are the books that he's written on intellectual capital: Models of Intellectual Capital, Proceedings from the World Congress on Intellectual Capital, and the Strategic Management of Intellectual Capital and Organizational Knowledge. So these are things that he's helped write and edit. And this model that I'm showing you is one that actually made a big impression on me many years ago when I first saw it. I think it was in 2005 when he presented at an APQC conference. And I remember at that time struggling with the idea of how to show the value of knowledge management, how to measure the effects of some of your interventions in knowledge management. It's always been a subject of great interest, but great controversy within our field about how do you show the value of knowledge management. And Nick had done some work to create this causal map of human capital antecedents and consequence, where he showed with various coefficients for each one of these the influence of things on the ultimate outcomes at the end. So on the right side, you see key outcomes like retention of key people, human capital effectiveness, and business performance. And so these arrows show the components that go into those, and the factors show the influence mathematically that he derived in his research for each one. Leif Edvinsson is Professor Emeritus at Lund University in Sweden. He specializes in intellectual capital management of enterprises, cities, and nations, innovations, and future centers. He's the world's first director of intellectual capital when he did so at Scandia in the 1990s. He's the world's first professor of intellectual capital at Lund University in the 2000s, and his honors include Brain of the Year from Brain Trust in the UK in 1998, and Ken Practitioner of the Year from Entivation in 2004. His books on intellectual capital appear here, Intellectual Capital Books, and finally the one on the right, Intellectual Asset Gap and Global Competitiveness. So he's written quite a bit in this field, certainly one of the thought leaders in this area. And this is one of multiple models that we'll see in this category, all of which have a lot in common, using some of the same terminology. Many of these people were forming these ideas at the same time early on in the development of our field. In this case, Leif's model of human capital, structural capital, and business assets. And then you see the components that go in there with the arrows between them, finally contributing to EVA, or economic value added, on the right side. Annie Green is an author, speaker, lecturer, journal reviewer, and member of several brain trust think tanks. She's an associate professorial lecturer at the George Washington University. She's the Knowledge Valuation Portfolio Editor for Vying Journal of Information and Knowledge Management Systems. She's the chair of the International Conference on Intellectual Capital and Knowledge Management from 2013, and the creator of the Framework of Intangible Valuation Areas, a model that identifies intangible assets within the business structure. Her books: Here, a framework of intangible valuation areas, the sources of intangible assets within an organization, In Search of Knowledge Management, Pursuing Primary Principles, and Making It Real, Sustaining Knowledge Management, Adapting for Success in the Knowledge-Based Economy. I mentioned her model, the 5A model, Framework of Intangible Valuation Areas. So it has 3 levels, starting with the alternatives, then the criteria, and then the goal. So the goal is prioritization of sources of intangible assets. The criteria include innovation, organization, socialization, and culture. And then the alternatives you see listed at the bottom: customer, competitor, employee, information, partner, process, product and service, and technology. The late Gordon Petrash was a pioneer and thought leader in the field of intellectual capital. He had expertise in developing and implementing processes and cultures that enable companies to maximize the value of their intangible assets. His work on intellectual asset management at Dow Chemical showed how corporations can manage their intellectual capital to improve the bottom line, and his specialties included intellectual asset management, intellectual capital value extraction, corporate and business management, patent management, business processes, and change management. Contributed a couple of key chapters to books: the Profiting from Intellectual Capital book, Extracting Value from Innovation, and Knowledge Management Classic and Contemporary Works. So didn't write his own whole books, but these chapters were important in these too. And here's his intellectual asset management model, which is in different phases, ending up in a phase 6 at the left side, starting in the middle here with phase 1. And you see the different elements that go into each phase and then the directions between the phases. St. Onge is the founder and principal of St. Onge Alliance. He has expertise in knowledge management, strategy, organization capability and learning, performance enhancement through cultural renewal, and leadership development. He developed and refined a model called the Knowledge Assets Framework, and he specializes in organizational performance, knowledge and learning strategies, communities of practice, values alignment, leadership assessment and succession planning, assessment of customer perceived value, and development and implementation of branding strategy. His books include Beyond the Deal, Leveraging Communities of Practice for Strategic Advantage, The Conductive Organization, and Breakthrough Performance for Mergers and Acquisitions in the Knowledge Era. His Knowledge Asset Framework consists of the knowledge architecture, the technology infrastructure, sitting on a foundation of culture. An integral part of the framework is the articulation of knowledge strategy. And he says this is best developed through a set of multidimensional questions to be addressed through dialogue with other members of the organization. Knowledge value creation must become a key theme in an organization before implementation begins. Tom Stewart is a strategist, senior executive, one of the thinkers who discovered and developed the concepts of knowledge-based businesses and the role of intellectual capital and thought leadership in strategy. He wrote a seminal article about intellectual capital that appeared and then became sort of the basis of the intellectual capital movement. He's an experienced research center leader, a book author, a business journalist, a publishing executive, C-suite marketing and knowledge management leader. He held positions as the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business Review. He was the chief marketing and knowledge officer of Booz & Company, executive director of the National Center for the Middle Market at The Ohio State University, and he had previous roles at Fortune magazine and in book publishing. And his two essential books in this area, the first one called Intellectual Capital, The New Wealth of Organizations, and then the second book, The Wealth of Knowledge, Intellectual Capital and the 21st Century Organization. And the second one, The Wealth of Knowledge, is one that I personally found a lot of value and used myself in the implementation of knowledge management and went through in very great detail, sharing it with my knowledge management team. His intellectual capital model shows that the tangible assets on top of the intangible assets make up the total market value, but his insight was that the intangible assets, which consist of human capital, structural capital, and customer capital, made up more of the value of organizations than the tangible ones. Prior to that, the tendency was to look mostly at tangible assets and not so much at the intangible. And that's a theme that runs throughout all of these thought leaders that we're talking about today. Carl Eric Spivey is professor emeritus at the Hanken Business School. His research interests are knowledge management, collective and distributed forms of organizing and leadership, and the dark unintended consequences of innovation. He's one of the first to define the fundamental concept of knowledge management and intangible assets, the first to recognize the need to measure human capital, and he pioneered accounting practices for intangible assets, testing them in his own company. Sveibe Knowledge Associates helps corporations and other organizations to transform themselves from traditional industrial era organizations to businesses that create high value from their intangible assets. Books include Managing Know-How, Add Value by Valuing Creativity, The New Organizational Wealth, Measuring and Managing Knowledge-Based Assets. And then the third one here, which I show both in the Swedish and in the English version, The Invisible Balance Sheet, was considered very important work. 3 types of capital that Carl Eric defined: financial capital, structural capital, and individual capital, and then the relationship between them, showing the 3 different kinds of companies and what their main focus is: the industrial company, the service company, and the know-how company. Carl Wig is the CEO of Knowledge Research Institute. He focuses on societal intellectual capital management and the building of competence. He's one of the founders of the knowledge management movement. A technical and management consultant and researcher, he started the Applied Artificial Intelligence Center at Arthur D. Little that initiated the concept of KM back in 1983. He's a former consulting partner at Coopers & Lybrand and the co-founder of the International Knowledge Management Network. His books include People-Focused Knowledge Management, Expert Systems, A Manager's Guide, and then 3 in a series: Knowledge Management Foundations, Knowledge Management, and Knowledge Management Methods. This slide asserts that knowledge assets are vital, intangible assets with an exclamation point at the end. So that was something that all of these intellectual capital thought leaders were on the forefront of advocating, which was the importance of intangible assets in addition to the traditional tangible ones. So here we see at the bottom technology assets, codified knowledge, human knowledge, and other knowledge assets. And then above that, rights, knowledge assets, and relationships. And then dividing up between tangible and intangible assets, making up the total of corporate assets. Now this slide is a more complicated one. It's called Intellectual Capital Management and Knowledge Management Selected Characteristics. So the point from this to take away is the different elements that go into this: different types of capital, different types of costs, different types of relationships. There's a lot that goes into figuring out what market value is. And I encourage you to come back and take a look at this slide at greater length. Our next category is the ISO standard. An ISO standard for knowledge management was developed, and it had these clauses in it: scope, normative references, terms and definitions, context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and improvement. Our thought leaders for the ISO standard are Chris Collison, Paul Corney, Patricia Eng, Nick Milton, and Ron Young. Chris Collison is a consultant, coach, trainer, and speaker. He's the owner and director of Knowledgeable Limited, helping organizations improve performance by discovering and sharing what they know. He's a former member of the KM team and the head of knowledge enabling systems at British Petroleum, which was well known and highly regarded for its knowledge management program. He is the former director of change and knowledge management at Centrica, visiting faculty at the Henley Business School, advisor to the International Olympic Committee, and a chartered fellow of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. His books are pictured here: Learning to Fly, an important one that he and Jeff Parcell co-wrote based on their experiences in knowledge management at BP, to Practical Knowledge Management from Leading and Learning Organizations. His next book was No More Consultants, We Know More Than We Think. He co-wrote with several of our other thought leaders featured here today the KM Cookbook, and his most recent is Return on Knowledge: How International Development Agencies Are Collaborating to Deliver Impact Through Knowledge, Learning, Research, and Evidence. Chris has provided a self-assessment that has a lot of detail here with 5 levels and 5 columns. This is used to figure out where you are on a KM journey. And many people often are fascinated by maturity models. I've advised that maturity models can be useful as a way of helping you figure out what's possible, and I caution against using them to harshly judge yourself. So you take them as an opportunity to see where you might go, what you might implement that you haven't yet implemented, what others have done, what's possible, but you have to apply them in a context-sensitive way to what your organization's situation is. Having said that, Chris's self-assessment model includes KM strategy, leadership behaviors, networking, learning before, during, and after, and capturing knowledge. And then he has definitions for each of these 5 categories at 5 different levels. So starting at the level 1, which would be the lowest level where people are just getting started with knowledge management, you took an example there under KM strategy, you would find that isolated people with a passion for KM begin to talk and share how difficult it is. So that's an example at level 1. And then you move up to the top, level 5. You have clearly identified intellectual assets. KM strategy is embedded in the business strategy, and the framework and tools enable learning before, during, and after. So that's sort of, the goal. That's where you try to get to. That's the vision. And this is helpful when you're thinking about a standard, about seeing where you fit in and how it's possible. Paul Corney is the founder of Knowledge et al. He's the former managing partner of Spark Now, an experienced practitioner, presenter, masterclass leader, lecturer, and consultant. He's a member of the British Standards Institute for the KM Standards Committee, KMS1, and a former visiting lecturer on Brighton University's MBA on Knowledge and Innovation. The 2 books pictured here, he co-wrote with our other thought leaders. Navigating the Minefield, a Practical KM Companion that he co-wrote with Patricia Eng, and the KM Cookbook, which we already saw with Chris, but was co-written by Chris, Paul, and Patricia Eng. Paul provided this vision of how standards are implemented. Anyone can suggest an idea for a new standard. All ideas for new standards are assessed. If they're approved, then a project is created. A committee drafts the standard. The draft is issued for open public consultation. The committee considers the comments. The updated draft is issued for final approval. Documents are then published. The standards are reviewed at least every 5 years, and anyone can comment on the standard. So this is sort of the process that goes through. It's not an easy one. It takes a long time. Getting consensus for anything like this is nearly impossible. But the people that doggedly persisted with this ended up with an actual standard and are to be applauded. Patricia Eng is the first certified ISO knowledge management auditor, which means that if you want to be certified as compliant with the ISO standard, you need to bring in a certified ISO auditor to do that auditing. And she is the first one so certified. As an engineer, she learned about knowledge management while on assignment at NASA. She was a senior advisor for knowledge management at the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, where she created and managed their first KM program. She spent 25 years as an inspector and auditor of quality and safety programs in the nuclear industry. She's the writer of standards and regulations and conducted the first comparative survey of women and men engineers. Same 2 books listed here, as I showed for Paul Corney. They were the co-authors on both Navigating the Minefield and the KM Cookbook. And then taken from the KM Cookbook is what we call the KM Chef's Canvas 1.0, which has a lot of detail. Once again, encourage you to get the book, KM Cookbook, and also return to this slide in the recording and take a closer look. You'll see the different things going in there, including strategic context, enablers such as roles, processes, technology, and infrastructure, and then evaluation and improvement on the right side, then leadership and support underneath, governance also on the left side. So these are elements that would go into helping define your direction, but also a way of assessing how you comply with something like the ISO standard. Nick Milton is a consultant, author, speaker, and instructor. He's the former knowledge manager at BP. So we see the multiple people here had a background at BP. He's a member of the working group ISO for the development of the ISO standard for knowledge management, which is standard 30401, and he's also a prolific blogger. Here's a number of books that he's written or contributed to. The Knowledge Manager's Handbook that he co-wrote with Patrick Lamb is an important one. Designing a Successful KM Strategy, he co-wrote with Stephanie Barnes. The Lesson Learned Handbook is another important one. So a lot of contributions here that are quite useful, including chapters that he contributed to some of the other books on the bottom. Nick has taken the time to try to bust some myths about standards. People will say that standards have certain negative qualities, but he says it doesn't define how you do KM. The standard is deliberately generic. You define what you do and how you do it within a framework. It's not only for big business. You can use it for any kind of organization. It won't take months to implement. Shouldn't be a burden. It's an opportunity to stand back and ask, could we do better? And you don't need to certify. There's no mandatory requirements for external audit. You can implement a standard and claim to be compliant to it. Ron Young is the founder of Knowledge Associates, an international knowledge and innovation management consulting and solutions company. He's active in the development of standards for knowledge management, including the ISO 30401 standard. He's an expert in strategic knowledge asset management and innovation. He specializes in knowledge-driven results for organizations. He's been a part of the British Standards Institute Knowledge Management, Innovation Management, and Asset Standards Committees, and the European CEN Knowledge Management Standards, and the International Standards Organization KM Standards Development Work Groups. 4 books that Ron has written: the Knowledge Asset Management, Upside Down Management, Revolutionizing Management and Development to Maximize Business Success, Knowledge Management and Innovation, Thriving in the Global Knowledge Economy, and APO Knowledge Management. Ron shows the interdependencies of the KM standards with other standards. So they don't stand alone. They relate to one another. So there are other ones that you can also look at in addition to the KM standard, including asset management, information records and security management, quality management, collaborative business relationships, and innovation management. And he also provided this graph on what is the ISO standard. So it breaks it down and tries to put some context to it. So it has plan, do, check, act, and a cycle, and then you see the different clauses from the standard represented here with the details underneath of what those mean. Moving now to our final category for today, strategy. Here are some of the themes that run through our strategy thought leaders. There's KM roadmap, steps to follow, KM models, approaches, motivations, types of strategies, and guidelines for strategies. Our thought leaders in strategy include Stephanie Barnes, Gloria Burke, Camille Dalkier, Mary Lee Kennedy, Carla O'Dell, Nirmala Palaniappan, and Melissa Rumazan. Stephanie Barnes is a consultant, author, and speaker, founder and chief chaos organizer at Telekey, which is her consulting firm, which is based on the realization of potential. She has experience in knowledge management, change management, strategy development, business transformation, and business analysis. And she's currently an advocate for what she calls radical KM, which focuses on and emphasizes creativity and playfulness. She was the speaker on a recent SIKM Leaders Community Call, where she explained more in detail about radical KM. And if you'd like to know more about that, I encourage you to go listen to that recording. She is the author and co-author of 2 books, Aligning People, Process, and Technology in Knowledge Management, and Designing a KM Strategy, she did with Nick Milton. She's defined this knowledge management roadmap, which starts with collect, moving through analyze, resolve, select technology, design, develop, test, implement, use, and evolve. So she would suggest that following this roadmap as a way to take a strategy and implement it. Gloria Burke is a former CKO, author, and speaker. She's the Global Director of Knowledge Management currently at Slalom Management Consulting. She's the former Managing Director of Knowledge Management at Charles Schwab. She's the former Chief Knowledge Officer at Unisys. And she specializes in digital transformation, knowledge management, enterprise collaborative networks, the future workplace, and culture transformation. She has expertise in strategic visioning, implementation planning, enterprise CAM platform transformation, critical knowledge capture and transfer, taxonomy development and implementation, communities and social network strategy, and change management. And Gloria also was a speaker on a SICAM call where she went through the approach that she took to implementing knowledge management at Slalom, and it was quite fascinating. She answered a lot of questions, and I found a lot of practical advice from that session. So once again, I encourage you to go listen to that recording as well. She contributed a book chapter to a book called Prove It, Using Analytics to Drive SharePoint Adoption and ROI. She recommends these key takeaways for building up a global knowledge center from the ground up, starting with establishing an end-state vision and strategic implementation approach, including a 3-year strategic roadmap and a 1-year tactical roadmap, conducting user forums. Obviously, advice that we all would offer: don't lead with technology, run a pilot and learn from it, create a robust communications and change management plan, and remember that it's a journey, not a sprint. Prioritize your build out, focus on business priorities and how KM can support that mission. Camille Dalkier is Associate Professor at the School of Information Studies at McGill University in Canada. She specializes in information and knowledge management strategy and systems, knowledge, taxonomies, and intellectual capital management. Her research focuses on collaboration success factors, creativity and innovation management, information and knowledge management, organizational learning and managing lessons learned, preservation and transfer of expertise, and tacit knowledge sharing. Her books are Knowledge Management in Theory and Practice, which has gone through up to 4 editions now, so I encourage you to check that book out with its latest 4th edition. So she's been really good about keeping it up to date. Intelligent Learner Modeling in Real Time, and Utilizing Evidence-Based Lessons Learned for Enhanced Organizational Innovation and Change. Committees that developed the Knowledge Management Cycle, or KMC model, which is a double loop learning model, and it has at the top, identify and or create based on a request for knowledge that you receive, and then moving through store, share, use, learn, improve, and repeating the cycle. Mary Lee Kennedy is the former executive director at the Association of Research Libraries. She's the former chief library officer at the New York Public Library, the former senior associate provost for the Harvard Library at Harvard University, the former executive director, knowledge and library services at Harvard Business School, former director of Knowledge Network Group at Microsoft, and the former corporate library group manager at Digital Equipment Corporation, where we both worked. And she has experience in market analysis, competitive intelligence, research and product information management, and internal communications. So it's quite an impressive background, working at a lot of important organizations where she had key roles. So it certainly informed her expertise based on that vast experience. 2 of her books, Intranets for Info Pros and the Emerald Handbook of Modern Information Management, where she contributed a chapter on leading and managing strategy in the 21st century. So Mary Lee's point is that strategy is best done as a social construct as opposed to a top-down strategy that's handed down from above. So she contrasts the 2 here. And on the left side, the top-down transformation, where decisions are based on management's knowledge, the managers lead, generally results in low employee engagement where 60 to 85% can't even describe the strategy. There's ongoing change management initiatives to try to get people to change, but according to this research, McKinsey survey of 1,500 business leaders, only a 30% success rate. That's from the Association of Research Libraries. On the right side, we see social network-based transformation, where the decisions are based on management's knowledge and employee experience with customers, competitors, and suppliers. Many leaders emerge. The employees drive the strategy. The need for change management is diminished or eliminated. And according to the McKinsey survey, 79% success rate. So this certainly corresponds to my own experience. I recall involved with some senior leaders in an organization that I worked at were trying to implement a strategy, and they were going to gather the 100 most senior people in the company to work on their purpose. And I suggested this would be a great opportunity to involve the entire company and use social media in the form of an enterprise social network to help provide not only input from everyone, but to give a sense of ownership to everyone that felt like the strategy or the purpose that resulted, that they all had a role in, and therefore they would own as part of it in its implementation. This was denied, and I felt that that was a mistake, and this learning seems to suggest that that should have been the way that it was done. Carla O'Dell is an executive, author, speaker, and practical visionary. She's an expert in using knowledge to drive productivity and competitiveness. She currently leads the APQC Board of Directors in its governance and oversight responsibilities, and she was the former CEO of APQC and a co-founder of it. If you're not familiar with APQC, it's a nonprofit organization based in Houston, Texas, that for many years has been one of the leaders in the field of knowledge management, holds an annual conference that's coming up shortly, and has done lots of research, has lots of resources, does training, does consulting, and has certainly been one of the leading organizations in advocating for knowledge management. She has written and co-written these books. The first one, If Only We Knew What We Know, she co-wrote with her late husband, Jackson Grayson. Certainly an important book, along with some of the others that I mentioned. She co-wrote with Cindy Hubert, The New Edge in Knowledge, How Knowledge Management is Changing the Way We Do Business. And then she wrote The Executive's Role in Knowledge Management. She has provided this chart of what motivates knowledge sharing and reuse. 60% say that saving time when looking for information or supplying knowledge to others is what motivates them. 52% improving productivity and quality by applying best practices and lessons learned. 41% improving productivity and quality by reusing intellectual capital across projects or groups. 38% improving decision-making through better access to knowledge. 21% decreasing time to competency for new hires or employees in new roles. And 20% reducing risk related to unsecured, at-risk, or inaccessible knowledge. Nirmala Palaniappan is Vice President of Knowledge Transformation Services at Genpact. She was awarded a U.S. patent for her CAM framework methodology and the toolkit she conceived, which, as far as I know, is the only patent awarded for a CAM framework. Her specialties include knowledge management strategy, culture and change management, business process improvement, branding and advertising, CAM technology concepts and enhancements, and business analysis. She has expertise in creating and implementing intranets, community tools, expertise locators, mobile applications, content management systems, internet portals, and social business tools. She's written one book called Finding Peace. And here is a view of her patent, the business-aligned organizational knowledge management system. So you see it has a lot of components in it. At the top, we see knowledge sharing, coaching, mentoring, collaboration, best practices, values, trust, win-win, and learning. And then we have explicit knowledge dissemination. And you see the other components that go under that. At the bottom, we see documentation, recording skills, blogging, after-action reviews, exit interviews, knowledge maps, knowledge audits, data mining, and business intelligence. And then In the corners, you see effective, you see serendipity innovations, you see efficiency, and you see business objectives. So this was the model that earned her the patent that was issued by the United States. And she's defined different types of KM strategies and given examples of each, which I found quite interesting. So there's one called the Integrate Everything strategy, another which is Connect Everyone, a third, Personalized Knowledge, a fourth, Embrace Differences and Multiple Ingredients, and a fifth, Inject into the Organizational DNA. So those are the 5 types of strategies that Nimi identified. And then she gave examples for 3 different types of organizations that would use these strategies. The first, a small, friendly niche area, not so tech savvy, and they would use Integrate Everything or Inject into Organizational DNA. A second would be a large, spread out, somewhat tech savvy, multiple domains and industries and services. They would use Connect Everyone and or Embrace Differences, Multiple Ingredients. And then the third is a large, spread out, decentralized, tech savvy, various roles, products organization. And there she would see Integrate Everything and Personalized Knowledge. Late Melissa Rumison was a highly regarded figure in the field, and her loss was definitely felt by our field. She was at the National Security Agency as the initial benchmarking manager and later part of the team that launched knowledge management at the NSA. She was later a knowledge strategist for Buckman Laboratories, which was considered one of the companies that really had an idea of how to do knowledge management effectively. That started from the top with the CEO. And she was the key person helping to implement it. And then she was later a senior knowledge strategist at SAIC. Her professional interests were storytelling, communities of practice, knowledge transfer, and adult learning. She wrote the seminal book, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Knowledge Management. And she identified these insights about knowledge management strategies. Strategic lessons learned. She said, copy the strategic planning experts. There's no perfect strategy for your organization. There's 2 primary strategies, connection and collection, and self-interest is good. What's in it for me? Strategy selection, the links to strategy, values, and goals must be crystal clear. The payoff must be sufficient to warrant the effort. The strategy should be portable across the corporation, and the corporation capacity for additional change should be positive. Questions for a knowledge strategist to ask include, what is the organizational context? What are the business benefits? How can KM methods be added so they are a seemingly seamless extension of ongoing work? How do we make it easier for people to do their work? The first steps would be an overall assessment of current knowledge state, a SWOT analysis for the organization and yourself as a KM leader, and then brace yourself for resistance, prepare, and pitch. So that brings us to the end of our slides today, and I'll turn it back over to Brad.
Thank you, Stan, for the wonderful presentation. And to our audience, please feel free to visit our website where you can download a copy of any of the books shown here. And if you have any questions on any of our software or our company, or would like to reach out to Stan, the contact details are on the screen. And please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to this series. On behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending, and until next time, thank you.